The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and FreedomSlips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, FreedomSlips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution.radio, the #1 listener-supported radio on the internet. I'm your host, Diamond, from the Oppenheimer Ranch Project. Joining us today, as usual, is my lovely partner and co-host, Leah Shaper.
Hello.
Those are nice earrings.
Well, thank you.
Let's jump into the show. We're going to tackle two topics and maybe a third, but the two topics that we're going to focus in on and do some scientific analysis are quite interesting. The first may have interest to listeners out there because of the upcoming total solar eclipse, which is happening this April. And we're going to discuss the erroneous correlation between earthquakes and eclipses. That'll be the first topic we discuss. And we'll go back into historic times to find out when the first ideas of this came about, and if any of it holds water, which it really doesn't. The second half of the show, we're going to discuss a fascinating topic, which may actually be the oldest story in the entire world. So this would be the oldest myth that we have, and it could date back 100,000 years. And I'm talking about the myth of the Seven Sisters. Some people know them as the Pleiades or the Pleiades. But we're going to dive into the topic that the idea of the Seven Sisters might go all the way back 100,000 years. Now, the paper is kind of dumb for a number of reasons, because it talks about 100,000 years ago, how everyone was waiting in Africa and we all spread out then with the myth.
Yeah, I mean, that's the basis for everybody that talks about this idea, is it's all based on the out of Africa hypothesis, which means, we'll get to this, but this means that it may not be 100,000 years old. It may be much younger than that.
Could even be older.
Or older, yeah.
So the first topic we'll jump into is an exciting topic because of all of the upcoming frenzy about the eclipse that is going to be crossing from Texas up to Maine in April 8th. Yeah. Now, do you think you and I are going to drive down to Texas to go see that?
I don't know. It seems like an awful long drive. I mean, I know it's a total eclipse and all, but we'll see.
Yes, it's a total eclipse that is going to be happening at solar max. So what that looks like is usually amazing. You can actually see magnetic field lines emanating from the corona during the eclipse.
I didn't even realize that. Yeah.
So this is a biggie.
Yeah.
Now, can you see the screen?
Yes.
And what are you looking at?
I'm looking at a picture of an eclipse.
Total solar eclipse. Now, the question is there a correlation between earthquakes and eclipses? What are your thoughts on that? Can a solar eclipse trigger an earthquake?
You know, it's funny because I remembered this morning that I was thinking about this during our annular eclipse last October, because I didn't remember that there were some significant earthquakes in Afghanistan at the time. However, those earthquakes preceded the eclipse. The eclipse was October 14th, and the earthquake started on the 11th.
Okay, so there was a timing issue. The other issue
well,
is...
maybe not. I mean, maybe coming into the eclipse could have been part of the equation.
Could be, but the only physical way that any alignment of planetary bodies could cause an eclipse is not by what scientists have claimed, that there's some type of tidal effect on the crust.
Right.
As opposed to like the ocean, which actually has a tidal effect.
Yeah.
That is probably erroneous. And hence the paper, the erroneous correlation between earthquakes and eclipses.
Right. I mean, one of the things that this paper kind of draws your attention to at some point is that if you look statistically about the incidence of significant earthquakes and eclipses, if you look at it statistically, there is no relationship. But there do appear to be minor trends. And so my thinking is this, that perhaps there is some effect, but that the effect is rather minimal, and you have a lot of other variables in the equation. So I don't really think you're going to see a statistical a pattern that's very obvious. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I think I can explain that. Let's discuss this paper first and start at the beginning. The beginning is that there is a long-lasting belief in the gravitational stress by the moon, and it would be responsible for earthquakes because of causing a tidal deformation of Earth's crust. That's the belief. When you actually look into the statistics, there's no statistics to support that. There, however, is, like you said, a slight trend, and that might be based on geologic facts. We're going to sum that all up at the very end, so we don't want to screw the pooch, as they say.
Right.
Now, even worse, earthquakes are sometimes said to be fallacious perception of coincidence. I'm sorry, earthquakes are sometimes said to be correlated with eclipses. I almost said a dirty word there. And in this paper, they review the origin of what is wrong with the statement and show that the idea is owed to the fallacious perception and coincidence. But what they're basically breaking down is historical accounts that are a long time ago that aren't very specific. Yeah.
Well,
So
I think it's also like people's memories, right? Like if there happens to be a significant earthquake around the time of the eclipse, it's going to stick out in your head the same way that it stuck out in my head last October, right?
Exactly.
But that doesn't necessarily mean anything. It was just striking. That's it.
Exactly. And so let's go back in the historical accounts of when this may have occurred. The same thing that happened to you. The first one to mention the coincidence of an eclipse with an earthquake was the Greek historian Thucydides, and this was in the 4th century BCE. He was primarily concerned with the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, but he incidentally told that there were 10 days between the solar eclipse of 21 March 424 BCE that was seen partial in Athens and an earthquake. So there were 10 days between the eclipse and an earthquake. Now, it's not quite clear whether Thucydides wished to insinuate a connection between the two, but there is a slight coincidence nonetheless.
If it's even a coincidence, right? Because,
it's
there might have been an earthquake, 4 weeks prior that was significant.
Yeah.
That he may or may not have even known about. I mean, that's the other thing in a historical account. If you're talking about somebody in Roman times, which is Thucydides, he's not going to know about earthquakes that happened in Japan.
Exactly. But therein lies the geology. So the only way the claims that they're making that the alignments cause tidal forces on the crust would mean that the earthquake has to happen in the vicinity of totality of the event. Right. It's not going to be happening 1,000 miles to the north or 400 miles to the east. It would have to be happening on the totality line. Correct?
Right.
And in order to get an earthquake, you typically need a fault. So we're starting to add up some of the clues here that the reason there isn't a direct connection is because these types of planetary alignments happen all the time. We just don't see the shadow. It's not rare. Earth is mostly ocean, so these shadows are going across the ocean and no one's seeing these eclipses. Right. And the fact is that faults are in very few places on Earth, typically on plate boundaries, subduction zones, things like that, near volcanoes, that the odds of a line of totality going over a fault that is ready to move is very low. Yeah. That makes sense. And in fact, this entire totality that's coming up in the US from Texas all the way up to Maine really only goes over one fault. And unfortunately, it's the big one. It's the New Madrid.
The New Madrid. Yeah. Well, and like I was saying earlier,
ready to go, we could see some activity there.
Sure. And like I was saying earlier, even if there is some effect, my instinct is that it's so mild, like mathematically, the magnitude of that effect would be so low as to get lost in all of the other variables that are involved in earthquakes, of which we don't even know all of them.
Right. So I'm
Right.
going to
So if you
reveal.
see some mild trend, that may be why. In fact, there's a chart in this paper that
So
kind of
the odds of the New Madrid faulting because of
yeah.
this eclipse are almost zero.
Mm.
Because the final conclusions, and we'll get out the rest of the science here, is that the only way, the idea of tidal forces on the crust is a fallacy because there's no correlation there. What there is a correlation is if the totality is going over the ocean and right at a plate boundary, let's say the Pacific on the subduction zone, that is the place because of the tidal forces of the actual water that has shown to trigger earthquakes. And in fact, there is a 3x increase in the areas that are underwater where totality is in increased earthquakes. 3x. So that's pretty
That's
high.
interesting.
Yes.
Okay, that's very significant.
Yeah. So but the odds of that are very rare.
Right.
Because
right.
this whole entire path is not going over any subduction zones that we're watching. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, and the other thing is you have to consider if that tidal force on the water creates a 3 times larger effect, the effect on the actual crust without that water is going to be significantly less because we're talking about crust rather than water, right? Obviously,
Right.
water is a lot easier to move.
So it's the weight
Yeah.
of the water that's doing it.
Yeah. Interesting.
Now, this totality does cross over. I have to look at the map. Maybe Central America, which is on the subduction zone. So
I don't think it does cross South America. Did you say Central?
Central.
Central. Okay, my
Yeah,
cross
because
Central
it's coming
America.
up through Texas, so it probably goes out like it comes up through Panama, then hits South Texas and ends in Maine.
Right.
But we'll have to look into that, and we'll keep a close eye on that during the event to see if anything does happen.
Yeah.
Now, some more coincidences, and again, correlation is not causation here. The naturalist Aristotle discussed in his book Meteorologica the reason for earthquakes a century later. He refuted 3 hypotheses of forerunners circulating at his time and alluded to a lunar eclipse, stating that both phenomenon would coincide sometimes. So according to Aristotle, he says that solar and lunar eclipses cause earthquakes.
Mm-hmm.
So they're just adding on more gobbledygook as time goes on there.
Yeah.
Now, Aristotle's own concept rested on winds produced by exhalations in the Earth's interior.
Yeah.
What?
but I did find that quote interesting, the idea of exhalations from the interior of the Earth, right? Because maybe there is something to that in terms of the forces inside Earth that have something to do with earthquakes, right? Which clearly there's no relationship to eclipses here, but it's an interesting way of it's like talking about ether, right? The concept of ether. It's not a concept we use today, but it does correlate.
And in some way works with the biblical allegory of enhancing the fate sent by God. The earth is exhaling and causing earthquakes. Like it.
Right.
And so after this type of allegory, the idea entered the Bible. And eclipses and earthquakes coalesced and were consolidated as portents. And this would be similar accounts referred to in 968 and 1133. Do you know what that refers to, portents?
I do not.
Well, it's amazing because this comes from a very early time, including going all the way back to the Aztecs. So apart from Euro-Asian peoples, a completely different culture has also drawn a connection between earthquakes and ellipses at a much earlier time, the
Eclipses.
Aztecs. They exhibited, including the Mayans, great fear from tremors from below. And the biggest fear, and so, but first let's go over to the creation myth of most of the natives. And they talk about the 5 suns. and each of the suns gets destroyed in a catastrophe. The next one coming is the earthquake.
Mm-hmm.
And so whenever there was an eclipse, the Aztecs would sacrifice people to prevent the end of the world, and they thought it worked.
Right.
Because the eclipse only lasted a few minutes. You kill enough virgins, and then the sun comes back out, and you're like, oh, hooray. Now, thank God eclipses don't last for like 10 hours. You imagine how...
But you can imagine the speed killing involved, right? Of the virgins. I mean, I'm laughing. It's not really funny, but...
So, yeah, what does it say here? Living under the fifth sun now, it will also perish someday. And this destruction will be brought about by earthquakes. This is according to the Aztecs.
Mm-hmm.
The Aztecs were convinced that the sun is under permanent threat. Isn't that weird?
Yeah.
They knew something. And condemned to a cosmic catastrophe. So they thought the sun was going to die. So every time an eclipse is happening, they probably thought the sun was dying.
Yeah.
That's got
It's
got to be a crazy world to live in.
How do you square that though? Just because, well, okay, so I guess it makes more sense when you consider that they're only going to see so many of the eclipses, right? There's a bunch of eclipses that they'll never have seen. Wouldn't even know.
And they couldn't really look at it. They just knew it's getting dark during the day. So they interpreted it as the sun was extinguishing, like it was going out.
Mm-hmm.
The eternal fire of the universe is getting cold. It's going out.
I mean, in one respect, I can identify with this, five suns idea that the world is destroyed and recreated over and over again. But it's really interesting that it's specifically linked to the sun, that these are all different suns creating these different worlds.
Yeah, yes. And that may happen again, right? So it seems like the explanation through Occam's razor would be the sun is the destroyer and not the other way around. Like the sun isn't getting destroyed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So this is interesting. And this correlates to what we were discussing about plate tectonics, tidal bulge, and eclipses, and an increase in only those zones.
Mm-hmm.
And so they looked into the Aztec history. And according to the paper, they gleaned in the study of eclipses during the Aztec time a good number of years in Aztec chronicles harboring both an eclipse and an earthquake. And the Aztecs live on a subduction zone.
Right.
So that could be why this is actually lining up there.
Yeah.
It says, unfortunately, it's difficult to extract how the two effects are enmeshed in the mindset of the natives. Because many original documents were destroyed by the conquistadors, they don't have good dating, so.
Yeah.
Okay, and then so let's get up to more recent times in the 19th century. Popularizer of natural history, Rudolf Flob. That's a nice name.
Yeah.
He developed the concept of extraterrestrial influences on geophysical phenomenon, mingling floods, earthquakes, meteorology, and astronomy. Oh my. It sounds like we're accelerating towards Hapgood and the Chan Thomas story of the Earth tilting on its side.
Yeah, right.
That's exactly what's happening here.
Yeah, yeah.
Were you going to say something?
Well, it only makes sense. I mean, it only makes sense for human beings to be kind of obsessed with the destructive forces on Earth, right? So, I guess over time, we're going to tend to conflate different kinds of disasters with each other, perhaps. Maybe that's how we get there.
And so there, at the same time, there is an actual breakthrough in actual science. Alexis Perry, probably in the 1870s, pioneering the field of geophysical research, suspected a correlation between earthquakes and the position of the moon. Now, that would be correct because it's the tidal forces of the ocean that can trigger earthquakes. And we also know this from watching tropical storms. So tropical storms tend to pull up huge bulges of water.
Yeah.
And we see these Cat 3 or greater storms fault boundaries, and they trigger earthquakes all the time. Now, Is it the low pressure zone? Is it the earth spot? Is it the tidal bulge? It might be all of them combined in that case.
Right.
Yeah. So over 150 years ago or so is when they made the correct connection first. Alexis Perry. So at the time of the theory of continental tectonics, I mean, it wasn't even born. It was 100 years out. That really didn't come into the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
So did we beat this with a dead horse?
Well, take a look at the next page. There's a nice chart of earthquakes above magnitude 7, corresponding to the Earth, Sun, Moon angle. And so, generally speaking, you could pretty much say that there's no trend here. There is a little teeny bit of a trend. There are actually fewer earthquakes at 0 degrees, but of higher magnitude. It's still real loose. And so this is where I say, if there's a tidal effect, it gets lost in all of the other data and information and the other variables that are going on to create earthquakes.
Well,
but,
I can kind of see the major effect on the tide here. It's
Yeah.
not really the 0 point. It's the approaching to high tide and the descent. It's shortly before and after. There's a clear correlation that it's at the 20 mark. There is a spike on either side. And actually you're kind of safest on this whole graph at 0.
Yeah, which is interesting.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. I mean, and this is only a data set of 15 years, but that's certainly, given the number of earthquakes above magnitude 7 in that time frame, that's a significant amount of data. I think that's fair.
And that shows you how often 7 to 8.8 magnitude earthquakes occur.
Yeah.
So in the near future, when they start occurring and people blame it on you and CO2, just remember the graph.
Well, and actually there's some good figures about that in this paper. I'll just quote here. It is estimated that around 500,000 earthquakes with a magnitude larger than 2 occur each year, detectable with current instrumentation. About 100,000 of these are strong enough to be felt, and 100 cause damage. So, I mean, that gives you a really good idea of how common earthquakes are, especially the ones that are perceptible to us. And why you really shouldn't draw any conclusions between the incident of an earthquake and something else, because there's a lot going on here and there's a lot of earthquakes. The chances of it being coincidence are quite high.
Yes. Yeah. And take a look at this also. An 8.8 is the highest reading on the range here. Mm-hmm. So an 8.8 or near 9 magnitude earthquake happens about once every solar cycle, because this is 15 years.
Yeah.
So, and that may have to do with the solar polar reversals triggering these high big ones here.
Yeah. Well, that would be interesting to look at if you could take this data and extend this data out another like 50 years or even more than that, maybe 100 years. That would be really interesting to look at, right? Because obviously this one 15-year segment doesn't mean anything by itself.
And even those seismographs were only recently went into major effect worldwide. So it appears as if more and more earthquakes are occurring, which it's not. It's more data.
It's more detection, right?
Even the crappiest seismographs back in the turn of the century would have captured all the 7 and 8 magnitude earthquakes worldwide.
Yeah. Well, and
so
that's one reason
the data set's there and it's good.
Yeah. And I think, for the reason you just said, having a data set that is 7 magnitude and greater would be much more useful looking a bit historically, let's say in the last 100 years or so, because we are going to know about those.
So the consensus is simple. A lunar eclipse occurs during a full moon, while a solar eclipse occurs during the new moon. Mm-hmm. But there is no statistical increase in seismic activity compared with any other new or full moon. Mm-hmm. Eclipse or not. So if you stop to think about it, the alignment between the Earth, Sun, and Moon is very precise during an eclipse, but the bodies come close to that alignment all the time.
Right.
And that's what people don't realize because they're not seeing eclipses.
Well, and then you could extrapolate this a little bit and think about other planetary alignments, right? Because this is another commonly claimed thing that planetary alignments cause earthquakes. But the effect of any other planetary alignment shouldn't be all that different from, let's say, an eclipse, which is basically an alignment of the sun, moon, and earth.
Right. So the planetary alignment would have to perfectly line up at the exact moment of the alignment over a subduction zone over the water. That
Yes.
is what almost never happens.
Right.
And so this article concludes it pretty good. During Earth tides, the surface of the crust rises and falls by just a few centimeters.
Mm-hmm.
But the ocean tides have a more pronounced effect. Some ocean tides change sea level by over a meter or more, which changes the pressure in subduction zones and the faults near the edges of continents. Now, how significant is this increased risk? Well, we revealed it, and the USGS calculates an estimation of 3x increase of an earthquake over these areas.
Interesting.
While this may seem like a lot, and it does, 3x. It
is a lot.
The risk at any given time is so extremely low that multiplying it by 3 still yields extremely low.
Right.
So there you go. We beat it with the dead horse. Can a solar eclipse trigger an earthquake at the perfect time, at the perfect moment over a fault line on the edge of the ocean on a continent? Yes.
That's pretty specific.
Now we're at the bumper, and there is no more bumper, so you can thank Revolution Radio for forgetting to put that on here.
Yeah.
Which means we have to sit in our seat for a straight hour. But if you have a chance and you like the content on Revolution Radio, become a Patreon and support the #1 listener-supported internet radio on the internet. That's a double, what did I do there?
You just used the word internet twice, that's all.
It's an internet.
It was a bit redundant.
Yes, redundant. That's the word. Now, the second story, we'll dive into it. This is going to be the more fascinating one. I didn't want to lead with it and then bore people at the end. So this is an ancient human story about the 7 sisters, and it may have survived from 100,000 BC. And so I'm going to go over the basic tenets of this idea, and then we'll dive into the specifics. Excuse me. There are 2 puzzles surrounding the Pleiades, or the 7 sisters. The first one, why are the mythological stories surrounding them, typically involving 7 young girls being chased by a man who's often Orion, associated with Orion, so similar in vastly separate cultures, such as the Australian Aboriginal cultures, and Greek mythology.
And I would add Native American cultures, India, Philippines. There are other places I'm not thinking of right now. The Dogon, they're all over the globe. This story persists.
And that brings us to number 2. Why do all of these cultures call them the 7 sisters when most people with good eyesight can only see 6 stars? And that's the conundrum. Now, this is a preprint paper we're going to share with you. Why are there 7 sisters? That has not been peer reviewed yet, but in the last 2 years, they've been working on it and articles have come out. Seems like about every year they've written an article on it.
This is a preprint? When was this published?
It wasn't. It's preprint.
But I mean, you know what I mean? Published as a preprint.
The end of 2020, beginning of 2021.
Oh. Interesting.
Yeah, so this is all dated to... Oh, no, that's an address. Yeah, there's no date on the preprint. But the preprint is coming from the article from 2021 or from December 2020. So it may have been printed since then.
It may have been also because I know I didn't find it out of lack of time, but there's apparently a fair amount of criticism of certain parts of this paper. So I'm guessing that maybe it has been published somewhere. Okay. Or maybe just people have been looking at the preprint. I don't know.
Well, if they criticize the preprint, it'll never go to print. unless there's a rewrite.
Right.
So they might not have gotten there yet.
Yeah.
But let's go over the theory here. If you look in the northern sky in December, you can all see Orion. It's the straight 3 lines, the belt of Orion. If you look up and right of there, a beautiful clusters of stars known as the Pleiades or the Seven Sisters is visible. If you look
right
careful
above Taurus,
enough,
the bull.
yes, if you look careful enough, you could count 6 stars, but it's almost impossible if you live in a city to do that at all.
Yeah, we can do it here.
Yeah, many cultures around the world refer to the Pleiades as the Seven Sisters and also tell quite similar stories about them. Now, I realized as a kid that the only way you could see 7 was using binoculars, but it never clicked with me.
Yeah.
I figured that the story must have come once they got binoculars, I guess. With binoculars, you can actually see quite a bit of stars, maybe like 15 or more.
Well, there are some people that claim that they can see more even with the naked eye. Like even up to, there's one person that claims they can see up to 13 stars in that cluster.
Wow, they must be a superhero.
Yeah, well, and then, we'll get to it, but there's additional questions about which stars are actually considered the Seven Sisters.
Exactly. That's interesting because when you start to reverse the archaeoastronomy, it could be any number of stars in the cluster.
Yes.
So the issue here that they came up with a few years ago is that if you study the motion of the stars very closely, this group believes that these stories may date back 100,000 years to a time when the constellation looked quite different, and 2 stars that are currently touching were a little further away and may be more visible from the ground.
Which are...
The problem with that is you're assuming that all of these stars have not changed brightness.
Well, that's taken into consideration in this paper as well.
Because many of the myths talk about one of the sisters copulating with a
mortal.
A mortal and then going into hiding by dimming and hiding behind another sister.
Yeah. I keep wanting to jump ahead here, so keep going.
Why do you want to jump ahead? So let's talk about the Greek mythology of the Pleiades.
Sure.
There were 7 daughters, so clearly they must have seen 7 of something.
And the 7 daughters are the daughters of Atlas and Pleione.
Yes, the Titan, Atlas. He was forced to hold up the night sky for eternity and was therefore unable to protect his daughters. Now, to save the sisters from being raped by the hunter Orion, Zeus transformed them into stars. But the story says one sister fell in love with a mortal and went into hiding, which is why we see only 6. Now, the second similar but far away story is Aboriginal from groups in Australia. And many of the Australian Aboriginal cultures, the Pleiades are a group of young girls, just like in the Greek story, and are often associated with sacred women's ceremonies and stories. The Pleiades are also important as an element of Aboriginal calendars and astronomy, and for several groups, their first rising at dawn marks the start of the winter.
The other part of the similarity here too is the girls are they're the Mary, and they're being pursued by a group of young men. I think they're called the Berry.
The lusty men are hunting them.
But they're also part of that general story too is that they're also like persistently gifting them with honey. So they're like, I guess, sort of trying to seduce them. So it's not quite that aggressive, but like they're being nice.
Right, but in the same story, the hunter of women, or Orion, and the women in the Pleiades, the Aboriginal stories say the boys or the man in Orion are chasing the sisters, and one of the sisters has died or is hiding or is underage or has been abducted, and that's why there's only 6. So they have the same excuse. It's weird.
This morning, I listened to a Lakota elder tell the story of the 7 sisters. And they're taken up into the stars. They're not there permanently by men who they want to marry, and they're told that they shouldn't pick this one. It's some kind of ground turnip. I don't remember what it's called. And the one young woman or sister, I don't remember if she's a sister, I think. She decides, well, they'll never know, and she decides to pick the turnip or whatever. And it causes like a hole to be formed that she can see through to her home. And then she starts seeing her family members and she misses them and stuff. And then she starts like picking all of the turnips, basically. She picks like hundreds of turnips or whatever. And I think then she, if I remember correctly, she like leaves the sky. That's what it is. She takes the vegetation from the turnips and she forms a braid with them all so that she can climb back down to earth. And then in the process, oh right, I forgot about all this. In the process, the braid breaks and she falls to earth. But she was also carrying a child at the time. And the child turns out to be this young boy who like helps everybody on earth. Like it sounds a little bit like a Lucifer story or a Jesus story. It's interesting. So it
or
definitely.
Quetzalcoatl.
Yeah.
Enki.
Yeah.
Now this Lost Pleiade, the Lost Pleiade story is found everywhere in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, in Indonesia, Native American and Aboriginal cultures. Many of these cultures regard the cluster as having 7 stars, but they all acknowledge that only 6 are visible, which again is like, what?
Yeah. Oh, by the way, apparently Islam.
Wait, and they all have a story to explain why the 7th one is missing.
Right. And so in Islam, the explanation for the missing 7th sister is that star fell to earth and became the Great Mosque.
Oh. So the question is, how come the Aboriginal stories and the Greek ones and the Native American ones are all so similar? Anthropologists used to think Europeans might have brought the Greek story to Australia, where it was adopted by Aboriginal people. But did they bring it to Native American culture? I mean, where did they visit everywhere?
Right. No, it doesn't make any sense.
It's the same excuse for why the Dogon know about the rotational periodicity of Sirius A and B.
Right.
Because some white guy went there and whispered it in their ear.
Right. Like that's the explanation for the most skeptical person ever, right? It's always that the white man like brought it to them because the other cultures were like too stupid to know this or something like that, right?
Right. And so here comes the paper. So based on all this idea, Norris and Barnaby got together and they looked at all the stuff. And then they looked at the archaeastronomy, and then they considered the Pleiades constellation itself. But before they did that, they came up with this idea based on Out of Africa, which you don't need. You don't need this to even put this in here. Because what may have been prior to 12,900 years ago is a global seafaring high technology society that everyone knew about, pyramids and architecture and all of these stories. They all knew about them. They told them to each other. And then each culture made it their own. So they're slightly different, but they're all the same. That's all you need. You don't need Chinese, Caucasians, Eskimos, and Africans all to emerge out of Africa from one guy.
Well, right.
It's in fact the dumbest idea ever.
Well, this is the problem that we have here, right? Because that is the accepted narrative about human evolution, that we all came out of Africa. But Robert Seffer very simply disproves this perfectly, because you have numerous tribes in Africa that have ghost DNA that no one else has. So if we all came out of, and these people they've never left. There's no evidence that they've ever left the continent. So if that's the case, then we can't all originate out of Africa, because we are all missing this DNA that they have. That DNA has to come from another hominid species, and we don't even know what it is yet, which is why we call it ghost DNA. So this idea that the only explanation for why everybody has the same story, which then means that the story originated more than 100,000 years ago before we all moved out of Africa, doesn't make any sense at all.
No, and in fact, all the new DNA sequencing is showing 3 or 4 groups, separate groups that evolved separately as hominids 150,000 years to about 1 million years ago.
Yeah.
And so the people that we call Native Americans and Asians came from a haplogroup in Siberia. You could trace it back 100,000 years. They didn't come from Africa.
Yeah.
And the African people didn't fly to Siberia and then migrate down. It's a separate group. The Africans were always in Africa. There's a European group that migrated into Anatolia. That's a different haplogroup. There are multiple groups of hominids coming from probably 10 or 12 ancient hominids like Denisovan, Floriensis, Heidelbergensis, Erectus, Neanderthalensis, Cro-Magnon. Yeah. So there's mixing, there's hybridization for millions of years. There's separate groups. And so this whole out of Africa is almost as dumb as plate tectonics, which suggests that 250 million years ago, all the continents were one island on one side of the earth, and the whole earth was a 18,000-mile ocean.
Yeah. Which would be really unstable. I mean, we should have a whole nother show about this, but this concept of merging of various hominid species has much better explanatory power for what we see in humans on Earth today, right? It's a much better explanation for widely varying skin colors and facial structures, and even like, things like Homo floriensis, which is a little hominid, could be the reason why we have people with dwarfism. And I said this to you a couple of weeks ago, but it makes me realize that this whole concept that we have of genetic mutation being the explanation for very different physical features, let's say like dwarfism, it kind of throws that out the window. The idea that it's a mistake, it kind of goes away when you look at it from that perspective, right? It's a relic of our previous hominid species ancestries.
All right, so we got that out of our hair there. All modern humans are not descended from people who lived in Africa.
Right. So you don't need to rely on that to explain this. You need a different explanation.
No, and the only explanation would be there's a high global society prior to the cataclysm that all shared similar stories.
Yes.
Which is why we get the whole story of Quetzalcoatl is the same as they're all the same story. As Enki coming. There are these human gods that interact with groups, that teach people how to have culture. Everyone has that story. It's not because they all lived in Africa.
Yeah. Well, and so the other big thing that needs to be resolved here is, what is this story actually talking about? Like, what happened that human beings knew that there were 7 stars and now we only see 6? And in this paper, these folks, Norris and Norris, they did some backwards astronomical calculation, and they said, oh, well, look, 100,000 years ago, well, actually here it says 100,000 BC, Atlas and Pleione were much further away than they are today. And so because they're close together, we perceive them as one star. However, and I haven't gotten into this yet, there's apparently some criticisms about the star movement that they use in here, that apparently these calculations that they used are kind of outdated and maybe not correct. So it may be that Pleione and Atlas were like twice as close in 100,000 BC than they are today. But the other problem that I have with this, that
as opposed to further away, they might have been closer.
Yes. But there's another problem here, and I'm surprised that I haven't heard anyone else mention this yet. This is perfect, this image here. Pleione and Atlas are the parents of the 7 sisters. They are not the 7 sisters themselves. There are still 7 more sisters in this constellation that we typically reference. And so this is sort of where the question of which stars exactly were people referring to as the Seven Sisters. Because part of the myth, the Greek myth anyway, is at some point, well, Atlas was already holding up the sky, but apparently they were put into the sky after their deaths as well, near their daughters here. So if it's Pleione that's disappearing, well, that's the mother, not one of the Seven Sisters. So what's actually going on here? And the other problem I have that with the idea that this is all based on the movement of the stars is that that's going to occur so slowly over the course of time that there's not going to be like a moment where everybody on Earth goes, look, one of the Seven Sisters disappeared. Like that's not going to happen because even over the course of a lifetime, the change in movement is going to be so slow that no one will ever notice it. So what happened? Something happened where one of these stars went away and human beings all acknowledged that and then created a story around it. Your mic is off.
I could probably answer that. We've had evidence of a major star in our night sky, Betelgeuse, that has become extremely dim in the last decade.
Right.
And so we could have the same exact thing happening here. And in fact, it might be Tau or Asterope or Seleno, which are not visible from the ground, that might have been much brighter in antiquity. And if in fact, over a period of a few days, it went away, everyone would have been freaked out, and you and you need to come up with an answer.
Yeah. Well, and that is acknowledged in this Norris and Norris paper as well, that a lot of the stars in this constellation are B stars, meaning that they do have a lot of variable brightness. So
yeah, these are some of the youngest stars in the universe. The oldest of them only date back 100 million years.
Yeah.
That is recent on Earth.
And while this does not match up time-wise, if the estimation of the age of these stars is correct scientifically, doesn't match up time-wise. But when I kept thinking about the story, there's a number of events that happened in the stories. The sisters were put into the sky as if they just like appeared there at some point, and so like, is there some kind of cosmic event that humans witnessed, perhaps, of the creation of these stars? Again, it doesn't match up scientifically to the timeline, but it did make me wonder.
Let's say this is a young cluster.
Yeah.
It's a young star cluster based on the electric universe theory. Mm-hmm. In the beginning phase of the creation here, there would be a plasma sheath blocking it from view from Earth. And after a period of 80, 100 million years, it may calm down and it may change phase and reveal all of a sudden a cluster of stars in the night sky.
Yeah, well, and as you and I have talked about in other shows, there are some reasons to question how we date the ages of stars, right? Because currently we do this all by like redshift, blue shift, but there's a number of reasons to criticize redshift as a reliable method of dating astronomical
and
objects.
Dr. Pierre Robitaille just put out he must have done it because we're talking about it now. 8 hours ago or yesterday, put out a video on the fraud in astronomy and astrophysics. That they have no idea how they're dating them. They're using the incorrect methods that have been proven incorrect, but they keep using them because it's in the textbook.
Right.
Apparently they didn't get the memo. And the memo is that everything you've done is incorrect and they don't want to hear it.
Well, it's the same issue as like, we keep going back to this idea and using this idea that we all came out of Africa, right? But where the scientific evidence clearly indicates that is absolutely not true. It can't be.
That's racist.
But yeah, we just keep going back to that.
It's racist. Didn't you know we're all Black Africans?
It's interesting too, right? Because there's a segment of people now in woke culture that like literally attribute the origination of everything to Africans, which is pretty silly.
I think you're just being racist. Well, let's talk about what actually happened. Let's talk. Do you want to sum up the Pleiades idea? concept. I don't think that this is the idea here that they're using. I don't think this happened at all.
I don't think that's it either. I don't think that it's the explanation.
Because the Pleiades are such a young cluster, they're highly variable. It could be the reveal from the plasma sheath. And then once they finally saw it, that some of the stars were blinking in and out and they changed the story. That's that simple.
Well, it could also be that it is a phenomena like what they described here with Pleione and Atlas, except that perhaps it's elsewhere in the constellation that's occurring. You know, maybe there's another star that we don't see as well now because it's too close to another one, right? Like that's certainly possible.
Or any of these lesser stars could have been brighter.
Right. Yeah. But still, because of the story and because the basic elements of the story don't really change all across the globe, that to me says that there must have been some kind of event that we saw. It's like, it's the same as why we would see certain plasma petroglyphs all over the globe, and it's the same petroglyph again and again and again and again. The story is just like that. So we saw something.
Yes, we did. We definitely saw something. Now, the Pleiades are represented in some of the oldest cave paintings in Lascaux.
Yeah. Yeah, which is really interesting in and of itself, right? Because when you look at that panel of Lascaux, you don't happen to have that image up, do you?
No.
It shows the Pleiades in relation to Taurus the Bull in the same way, as well as Orion is in there and some other constellation I'm not thinking of right now. So that's pretty interesting. And then there's evidence that some of the other even older cave paintings in France may have astronomical notation in them as well. The Lascaux paintings, I just blow my mind every time I look at them. They're so beautiful, right? And the earliest, the youngest that these could be is like 17,000 years for Lascaux anyway. And they're absolutely stunning. I mean, this is like what we would call high art today. And yet, you know, we claim that we were all cavemen in this period. It's so ridiculous.
There we go. And you can see that there's other scenes that are harder to see. I mean, there's so much to see here.
I think that the panel with the Pleiades in it, I think the bull is like colored in brown. And so then the Pleiades appears off his right shoulder. Not right shoulder, above his shoulders. I don't see it here.
No.
But
I don't, but it's a good segue to this article that just came out.
Yeah.
Archaeologists found a record-breaking artifact at a U.S. butchered mammoth site. Mm-hmm. And again, these are not Black Africans. These are people that are related to Siberians, and they're called the Clovis culture, and they have that haplogroup from Northern Asia. And during around 16,000 years ago, Beringia was flourishing with all kind of mammoths and animals feeding on that steppe of grassland, waiting for the comet to come in to flash freeze them in the mucks. But there were humans carving, and this is a hair bone. Mm-hmm. It's a bone bead from Wyoming, and it represents the oldest known bead ever found in America.
Yeah.
And you know what's right before the cosmic catastrophe known as the Younger Dryas.
Yeah. And those cuts in the outside of the bead, I mean, that's the real indication that this is a human formed object. You know, this article is funny because it sort of talks about the fact that this bone bead is from a hare as being super novel. Like they're like, oh wow, we discovered that these people not only hunted mammoths, but also hares, like as if that's some big revelation when that seems like it just makes sense that you're also going to be hunting small game. Like, why not? That's a lot easier. That's funny.
Yeah. And in the desert Southwest, that's one of the only mammals that lives in the desert, the hare.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this is Wyoming, but yeah. Yeah. It's not exactly novel. But you know,
you'd be surprised how much of Wyoming is desert.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. Yeah, I just, in my head, it doesn't really fit into the location of Desert Southwest, but yeah, fair enough. So, and then they also talk about in this article that they're like, well, in Asia, we found beads as early as 35,000 years ago.
Yep.
So again, I don't really find this all that novel. The reason it's novel is because it breaks the narrative that human beings were in North America for as long as it appears that they have been. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, there's no reason to assume that humans were not in North America up until a certain date. I don't see the reason for that, but that's the narrative.
Yeah. I think hominids lived everywhere on every continent since we were hominids.
I agree.
Great show.
Why do you think there were so many hominid species?
I wonder why. We all lived in Africa.
Find us tonight, 8 p.m. on Magnetic Reversal News.
Be safe.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. We'll be right back after this message.